Welcome to this bonus episode of Interior Analysis. I'm Evan Wessman. So if I get this out when I plan to, this will come out on July 25th, 2024, which marks 10 years to the day since I started doing film criticism. I obviously wrote and recorded this a little before that 10-year mark, but I thought it was a good time to take a look back and reflect on what I've learned throughout that time. If you're a returning fan, this is going to be different than the other podcasts and video essays we do. And if this happens to be the first thing that you've seen from our channel, I'm not going to say this is a bad introduction, but it's not the kind of video that we usually make. Today there's no co-hosts, no B-roll graphics. Might throw a few visuals up for the YouTube version, I guess we'll see. But it's pretty much just going to be me reading off a script on camera. I'm not trying to make this with the intention of instructing anyone. It's more of just a retrospective for myself. I might give this like a clickbaity title that makes it seem more like advice, but that's not really how I want to approach it. Still, I've learned a lot through this time, and hopefully that means some of you can get something out of hearing me talk about it. I just want to emphasize that even though 10 years is a good amount of time to be doing something, and I feel like I can say I've gotten pretty damn good at this, I'm not trying to come at it as like an expert. So I'll start out summarizing more of the chronological process of how I got into film criticism, and then in the second half I'll go into some broader things that I've learned. The actual day that this video is commemorating is, of course, July 25th, 2014. Which is the day I wrote my first movie review on IMDb for The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey. I didn't mark it at the time or anything, but IMDb timestamps your reviews when you post them, so that's why I remember the exact day. And from there, I just kept reviewing stuff that I'd seen in the past year or so. After a few weeks of that, I was reviewing every movie that I watched in the order I watched them, and for the next couple of years, I probably wrote about 6 reviews a month. My process was basically that I'd watch the movie first, obviously, then it'd probably take like 2 months for it to get to the top of the list, so I'd refresh my memory by going back through the IMDb page. I'd always read the entire quotes page, and then I'd watch trailers and clips and sometimes behind-the-scenes stuff if they had it, and read a few reviews from other people. Usually it was a couple positive ones, a couple negative ones, and a couple that were closer to my rating. Sometimes I'd go through the FAQ page if there was one. A lot of movies don't have much on there, but some of them are like massive. One of the first movies that I reviewed was Inception, and one of my core memories was reading that entire FAQ page. I wouldn't have named Inception as my favorite movie immediately after reading that, but I know that's how it became my favorite. There was some evolution to how I wrote the reviews. Initially, I was pretty unfocused with it, and I think my basic goal is just to kind of make general evaluations about the movie in question. I know I tried to be pretty objective about it and make pretty clear distinctions about what was my opinion and what was my like unbiased evaluation. In that early stage and for several years later, I definitely believed there was kind of an objective way to evaluate art. In more recent years, I've stopped using the word objective because I think it's not a smart way to approach criticism, and I'll get more into the nuances of that later. After a while, I developed kind of like a loose structure for the reviews. I'd have like an opening paragraph where I tried to make some overarching statements about the movie. Then I'd take maybe a paragraph to focus on theme, one to focus on characters, and probably one focusing on like a genre or technical things. The topics usually varied based on the movie I was talking about, but that was kind of the basic general structure I did for all of them. Then usually the last paragraph would like wrap things up and make a couple of recommendations, and then I'd end it with my rating, which was always very specific, like a 7.8 out of 10. IMDb also made every review have a headline, which I never felt like I was very good at doing. I usually would try to make it like kind of an overall summary of my points, but if I'd had the option to not do them, I probably wouldn't have. And just to get it out of the way, I took all of those reviews down a few years later. I think it was in like, I want to say mid-2021. And I tried to save all of them in a Word document, but I ended up losing it by accident, so I can't actually go back and read any of them now, and I'll get into why I did that later, but if I sound vague when I'm talking about them, it's because I'm just going based on memory for stuff that I wrote like anywhere between probably 4 and 10 years ago now. And I don't know how many of them I actually reread, so, it's very fuzzy memories of that. I don't know if there was a whole lot of valuable criticism in the reviews themselves, but I think it was still valuable to write them because there was a lot of essential growth that happened in those first few years. I know my taste and my general film knowledge went through a massive expansion. At the time I started writing reviews, my film knowledge was limited to like the kids' movies I grew up with, a couple dozen sports movies, a handful of Christian movies I'd been made to watch, a pretty decent amount of action movies from the previous couple decades, maybe a dozen or so dramas, and then like a couple dozen older comedies. I'd probably seen less than 10 R-rated movies and only I think 5 or so that I would now consider among my like all-time favorites. So being on IMDb introduced me to a whole bunch of stuff that I'd never heard of or thought to try. I just end up clicking through from one movie to another and finding stuff that had high ratings, and then if it like came up on Netflix or I found the DVD at the library, I'd probably watch it. I remember at some point in those first couple of years, my mom made some kind of comment on how my taste had changed. I can't remember what it was in reference to, but she kind of noted how I'd gotten more critical with what I liked, but I'd also become more open minded in terms of genre. And I think that was probably like the first tangible point of growth that I went to. Like when I was 15 and just starting out, I never would have watched Amelie because it like didn't have a Hans Zimmer score. But then I found it on Netflix when I was 17, immediately tried it, and it just instantly became one of my favorites. For a very specific example, I remember I was pretty excited to go see Furious 7 in theaters because it had like a dope trailer and looked like it would have cool action. But then 2 years later, Fast 8 came out, and I was like, no, that's going to be dumb. Let's go see Gifted instead, which turned out to be mid. But you see my point there. Aside from that, I don't know that there was a lot of visible improvement that I showed other than just spending a lot of time thinking critically about a big variety of movies. I'm sure if I went and read through all the reviews over those 5-ish years, I'd probably be able to track changes and growth in there, but as I said, I'm just going based on memory. There's some other stuff from this period that I'll talk about later, but one other thing that I think was significant during those first 4 or 5 years was that I didn't really have influences. I listened to the podcast Script Notes, which is great, and anyone interested in screenwriting should definitely listen to it. I've gotten a lot of great writing guidance from it, but that show is not a review show. It's very insightful, and the hosts and guests are all very smart people, but I don't feel like that influenced my reviews. And I would read other people's reviews, but there was just randoms. I didn't have like one reviewer that I went to. I guess if I had any influence, it was kind of IMDb as a whole. I didn't like agree with every rating on there, and there's stuff that I thought and still think was like overrated and underrated. But for the most part, if something had high ratings, I gave it a more serious look, and if it had lower ratings, I would mostly write it off. So I think that atmosphere and kind of their ratings just as a whole definitely influenced my taste, but I wouldn't say that it had any influence on like the style or approach that I took to writing my reviews. A change definitely started happening though when I got to college. For one thing, I slowed down with the reviews quite a bit. And by the way, this is about like 3 years after starting, I want to say. So I started slowing down with the reviews quite a bit at that time because I was starting to take screenwriting and playwriting classes, and I wanted to put some more time into that kind of work. I still wrote some reviews, some for me and some for my school newspaper, but it probably dropped from like, I'd say in high school I was averaging maybe 5 to 6 reviews per month, and in college that dropped to probably 2 or 3. But that was also a time when I finally started gaining influences. Initially, I found a couple of Just Right videos, but the much more significant influence that I found is the YouTube channel Lessons from the Screenplay. I would still consider them one of the best video essay channels out there, even though they mostly stopped making actual videos a couple years ago, but their podcast Beyond the Screenplay is still going strong, and that is hands down favorite podcast of any kind. If you're familiar with their videos and you've watched some of my earlier video essays, you can probably see their influence. I think I've evolved my style since then, but through watching the Just Right videos and lessons from the screenplay, and kind of combined with like the Script Notes podcast that I was still listening to, that was kind of how I came up with the idea to do this podcast, because I'd already been, throughout like the months prior to discovering them, I've been trying to get a lot more like intentional and like in depth with it. And those videos kind of gave me some clearer direction for how to do that effectively, instead of just like going through scene by scene and trying to figure out exactly what each word was doing. So that summer between freshman and sophomore year of college, I printed out a few scripts for stuff that I wanted to analyze, and I just got like insanely thorough with highlighting and annotating all of them to try and pull apart all the writing techniques that went into them. I did all of that, like super in-depth, like close reading. And then from there, I got Karla on board as my co-host, and when we got back to campus in the fall, we started recording episodes. And from there, we have the podcast and the channel as it exists. So I'm not really going to talk about everything since then, because it's just all there for you to listen to. And, I stand by most of the takes that I've had on here, even with older episodes. Not all of my takes, but most, as I can remember. And as a side note, I pretty much stopped doing reviews when I started this podcast. There were a few more that I did, I know, but if memory serves me right, I stopped doing them. The last one that I wrote was in October 2019 for Zombieland Double Tap, when that came out. So all total, I think I got to like 319 reviews. I know it was over 300, but it was definitely not more than 330. So at this point, I'll stop the chronological section and get into more of the broader lessons that I've learned. And again, I want to frame this less as like 7 ways to be a good film critic, and more as like 7 things that I have learned. 10 years is a long time, but I'm still pretty young, and there's a lot more that I know I have to learn as a film analyst and generally just as a person. So if I'm still in the game and I do another one of these in 10 years, maybe I'll agree with my takes here, maybe not. I guess we'll see. So, lesson 1, try a lot of new things. I talked a couple minutes ago about how expanding into stuff that I'd never tried before was probably my earliest point of growth, but it's still something that I try to do now because there's still blind spots that I have. But my general rule of thumb is that I can't knock it until I've tried it, and I think it's very limiting to only watch things if you think there's a good chance that you'll like it. In terms of being a critic, I find that, I'm not exaggerating when I say this, every movie that I watch makes me more knowledgeable in some way. Some more than others, of course, but I truly believe that I can learn something from just about anything if I look at it in the right way, because I pretty much have, especially in recent years. In terms of just enjoyment, I've found stuff that I love from all kinds of sources. There's certain things that I still generally prefer and genres that I gravitate towards, but I've found that I like stuff from just all kinds of sources. So to casual movie fans, I always recommend going outside your comfort zone. And I will be real with you, you are going to find things that you don't like in that process. But I promise you will also find unexpected favorites if you keep exploring, and I think that it is definitely worth your time. I especially recommend trying out genres that you haven't explored much, because in my experience, every genre has something good to offer. I've, at this point, found enough movies from genres that I typically dislike that I've pretty much stopped factoring genre into the equation of whether I think I'm going to like something anymore. The IMDb Top 250 is a good place to start, and there's some good Letterboxd lists that can probably give you a good watch list if you're kind of a normie that's looking to expand your taste. I'm not trying to use that term normie like in a derogatory way, just like, you got to start somewhere, and this is a place to start. And I just made this past week my own Letterboxd list of stuff that I would recommend as like a kind of starter pack to expand your taste with, and I put a link to that in the description. And the nice thing about movies is they're pretty short. Like with something longer, like a book or a TV show, that can be a lot to force yourself through if you don't like it. So I don't recommend doing that just out of curiosity. I do know a guy who forces himself through a lot of TV shows that he doesn't like, and I respect his choice to do that, but I don't understand it, and I definitely don't have the patience to do it myself. And coupled with this point, I want to recommend watching things more than once. I wouldn't say everything deserves a second try, but a lot of things do. I've always liked Inception, but it didn't become my favorite until the third time I saw it. And I have a whole Letterboxd list of movies that I want to rewatch because it's been a while and maybe my outlook on them has changed. Even like for this podcast, we covered Sorry to Bother You, which I'd been like kind of weirded out by the first time. And then when we revisited, I was like, oh, I actually love this, and I didn't really realize first time. Unfortunately, the reverse can kind of also happen. I wish I could still enjoy the third and fourth Pirates movies as much as I did when I was 12, but I just don't, and I am a little bit sad about that. But to wrap up this point, I think it's good for everyone to try out new stuff, even if it's only occasionally. Lesson 2. Look beyond your own opinions, but acknowledge them. This is one of the most important early steps toward being a better analyst that I tried to take. I say tried to because I don't want to assume that I was successful, and I don't think it's something you can ever do perfectly. I talked earlier about looking for objective quality, and that's something that I don't really believe in anymore. I definitely used to use that term on the podcast in ways that I don't stand by anymore, and I would take those back now. That said, I think it's possible to separate the text of a movie from how you individually experienced it. And one of those is not superior to the other, it's just important to try to distinguish between the two as a critic. In the earlier years when I was writing reviews, I often had an urge to assert my taste as more refined and superior, and I was a lot faster to call something overrated or underrated based on my own enjoyment of it. I don't think I ever went too far down that road, but even while I was trying to differentiate between my own experience of something and how well made it was, I think it's definitely fair to say that those things still got muddled a lot. But something I would tell my 16, 17-year-old self is that it's okay to like stuff that's kind of bad, and it doesn't invalidate you from having good taste, because he definitely did not believe that. I shouldn't say like in the third person. I did not believe that. And nowadays I try to take more of a policy of giving things a pretty fair shake before calling them underrated or overrated. Going back to what I was saying about rewatching things, what I really make a point to rewatch is stuff that is critically acclaimed or generally well liked that I didn't really click with the first time. And when I go back to them, if I still don't really vibe with it, I really try to figure out why people might like it, even if I don't. And sometimes I can see why, other times I can't. But I still don't necessarily use that as justification to say that celebrated movie is bad, actually, because maybe that's just a me problem. So I'll give a few examples to explain that. The original Blade Runner is a very celebrated movie that I find kind of boring. I can see that there's really cool sci-fi world building, and it's exploring some deep themes in interesting ways, but it just doesn't compel me, so I don't apologize for not liking it, because it is kind of slow, but I don't say anything bad about it because I think that's more of a me problem rather than like an issue with the text of the movie. With Lady Bird, I saw that in theaters and didn't enjoy it, and then it got a whole bunch of Oscar nominations, and I went around saying how overrated it was. This is a side note, but it's kind of a fun anecdote. So Lady Bird came out my freshman year of college, and then maybe like a month or so after I saw it, I'm in my dorm, and my friend Kelsey, who actually designed our logo, comes storming down the hall screaming at me because I had put Lady Bird on my overrated movies list on IMDb. And I truly don't know how they found it, but I guess a few of my friends had somehow found my IMDb profile and were looking through all of my ratings. I didn't like send them a link or anything, and I don't think you can even like search users on there. So I honestly to this day have no idea how they found it. But anyway, the following months after like seeing Lady Bird and putting it on that list, I kind of pulled back on calling it overrated and considered that maybe I'd been blind to some of its better qualities. And then a few months ago, earlier this year, I finally did rewatch it, and it worked better for me. I still don't love it. I have specific things that I can point to that don't work for me, but I can also see that those things that I bump on do serve a purpose and it deserves the praise that it gets. So it's a place where I can justify my lack of enjoyment, but I don't think those things make it bad. So I've stopped calling it overrated. Long story short, too late. On the other hand, I feel pretty comfortable saying that the Pixar movie Up is overrated. And if you're a big fan of it, you might want to skip forward like 30 seconds or so. I saw it in theaters as a kid, and then a couple years ago I tried it again, and I have heard people praise it for all the years in between, but all of that praise is for the first 15 minutes. And yes, the opening up until the house flies away is fantastic. And if it ended there, I think it could make a legitimate case for being best animated short of all time. But there's another 80 minutes of movie after that, and I feel like it just adds nothing and devolves into being an annoying kids movie. What I think happens is the opening is so good it makes everyone forget about the rest of it. So in a case like that, like I don't want to say people shouldn't enjoy it or anything like that, but I do object when I see it on like best of all time lists because I feel like it just is undeserving of that. So basically my rule is that I have to legitimately try to see the good in something before I can call it overrated. And sometimes that means watching it twice, but in most cases, regardless of how many times I've seen it, I try not to let my dislike of something get to the point where I judge people for liking it. There's very rare exceptions to that, but it mostly just comes down to like real life political issues. I'm not going to get into those cases, I'll just say they exist. And I've been talking about acclaimed stuff that I don't like, but the reverse is also true. Whether you want to be a critic or not, I was kind of saying this earlier, I don't think you have to apologize for liking something that's widely considered bad or has like legitimate issues. That's what guilty pleasures are for. So with the line between stuff that I consider underrated and guilty pleasures, I kind of adopt the opposite policy for what I do with stuff that I think is overrated. I don't apologize for liking it, but I'm also not going to try to convince anyone that it's great. And again, I have to give it a fair shake and hear out other people's criticisms. So it's like a give and take. I'll give everyone else Up and Ready Player One and let you all enjoy that, but you got to give me Nacho Libre and Amazing Spider-Man 2. Lesson 3. Hold space for other takes. So this is similar to what I was saying in the last point, but it deserves its own section. I feel like the best criticism, the kind that I usually strive to do and the kind that I seek out, looks at movies through different lenses. So that might be the lens of the creator, or a historical lens, or a lens that's informed by race or sexuality, or the lens of a certain political ideology, or like a genre lens, or technical innovation. Or it might be something that's not super complicated and just is a lens of general enjoyment. But I feel like criticism that starts and ends with just one person's opinion and doesn't look at it in any other way isn't that valuable. Good criticism can start from a point of just a person relating their individual experience with a movie, but it has to expand beyond that in some way. And, I didn't really do this with this intention, but that's kind of what we do every episode on the podcast. We'll start out with everyone giving their initial reactions and, at least giving context for just what they thought of it. But then we always expand beyond that in the rest of the episode. And in some cases, I think to really engage with something, you have to try to look at it through certain lenses. A really simple one is just any movie that's based on a book, it's important to give context for whether you've read the book or not. When you're talking critically about Get Out, you have to be conscious of your own racial identity and experience because that's going to affect how it hits for you. If you're going into a parody, like Not Another Teen Movie, you have to view that in context of the teen movies that it's riffing on. And, one that we've gone to is it can be very valuable to engage with The Amazing Spider-Man, both through the lens of somebody who saw the Raimi Maguire movies and someone who didn't. But on the other hand, it's probably not that valuable to look at Infinity War through the lens of somebody who's never seen another movie in the MCU because it's just not made for them. And connected to that, I've kind of come to resist the type of criticism that says a certain creative choice is always good or bad. My problem with the cinema sins, cinema wins style of criticism that just dings individual moments and shots and lines as binary good or bad is that it isolates them and divorces them from context. Something like a voiceover narration or using a long take isn't a good or bad thing because there's some places where it's called for and others where it's not. And every different story calls for creative choices that are unique to it. So I just find it very narrow-minded to engage with them in that way. And I know that probably sounds obvious to a lot of you. I'm not saying anything groundbreaking there, but I think just that is an important way to approach criticism. And on an individual level, I think it's also important to just be conscious of the default lenses that you view things through individually. Your experience in society in terms of race, gender identity, national origin, class, sexuality, age, religion is all important to at least be aware of. And it's not even necessary in a lot of cases to explicitly acknowledge that. The fact that I'm a 25-year-old cishet white guy probably doesn't really factor into how I look at a movie like, say, Arrival or something. But it's at least worth keeping in the back of my head that I'm still viewing it through that lens. I talked to a friend about the Gritty Fairy Tales video as I was making it, and she pointed out that that trend has a very strong ethos of white feminism, and I think there's a very interesting examination to be done of that trend through a feminist and racial lens. But I didn't really go into that much in my video because that's just not a perspective that I'm educated or well positioned to talk about. So some of what I just said is probably obvious to a lot of you. I think many, if not most people, understand that two opposing takes on a story can both be valid as long as they're not ignoring anything that's there textually. And I don't think it's really possible for any one person to look at anything through every possible lens. I've just found that it's good to acknowledge the lenses that you personally can look at something through and try to hold space for other perspectives without assuming them. Lesson 4. Find smart people who see things differently than you. So this is something I did not do for a long time. I mentioned that in those early review days, I didn't really have influences, and I think that slowed down my growth. But even then, I would usually try to read a couple of positive and negative reviews for whatever movie I was getting ready to review, just to see what other people said about it. Since discovering the YouTube video essay scene, I've found people who look at things different from me, which has been great. There's some people who I like and I watch their stuff because they approach things similarly to how I do, and others who I like because they think completely differently from me. And I think if you can find smart friends in real life who have different opinions and tastes than you, that's even better. One thing that I really liked about having Karla as a co-host was that she and I had very different tastes and approach things very differently. And David and Jelani definitely have tastes that are different than mine, and both of them have exposed me to some stuff that's outside of my typical wheelhouse. But I think our tastes are a lot more similar to each other than mine and Karla's were. She's one of a few people that I've known where if they recommend a movie to me, I don't necessarily expect to like it, but I know it's going to be worth my time and it's going to be interesting. So I would hope that all of you are lucky enough to make friends with some interesting people that have good taste that's very different from yours. And I would hope that I'm that friend to some people. But I also want to emphasize the word smart in this point. Dumb disagreements with people who lack good media literacy are usually a waste of time and energy, so I try to just avoid those. But smart disagreements, I've found, are a great learning opportunity. This might just be a me thing, but I'd much rather hear someone disagree with me very smartly rather than someone who agrees with me very dumbly, because the disagreements is where I learn. I might never rewatch Bullet Train, but when we did our podcast on that, Jelani made some points on that made me appreciate it more than I did initially. I just rewatched Jesse Gender's video on the Matrix Resurrections, and it doesn't make me like that movie, but it does make me appreciate that it's trying to do and say things that I didn't notice at all while I was watching it. Or with Maggie Mayfish's 3-part analysis of Zack Snyder's filmography, I don't agree with all of it, but the way she looks at his work made me reconsider how creators unconsciously impose their worldview into what they make. So I always would rather engage with something like that than like a Cinema Sins video about why the Gray Man is terrible. So just to end this out, I'm going to plug some of the people that I look to as influences that maybe some of you want to check out. Or, let's be real, you probably already did because they're much bigger than we are. So, Lessons from the Screenplay, I already mentioned. Excellent, especially for writing techniques, and their podcast Beyond the Screenplay absolutely rips. Just Right is kind of like similar. They're a little less mechanical, but they also have really good writing videos. Lindsay Ellis, probably the best analyst I've found for talking about why something is bad in a very smart way. Although recently she's also branched out into being more appreciative of things she likes, which is also good. I like those videos too. Patrick Willems, I feel like, has become more of an influence on me recently, and I really like the way he tackles like big, broad issues. Taylor D. Adams is an internet friend I had on the show recently, and his Film Nuts podcast is a lot less criticism based, but he and his guests that he has on are really good at exploring why our favorite things become our favorites on a more personal level. Broy Deschanel is a channel that can make things that I have zero interest in fascinating to me, like Love Island or Sam Levinson. And they have a side podcast, Rehash, that I also find really insightful. Thomas Flight and Like Stories of Old are two channels that are kind of like artsier and more cerebral. And these aren't film channels, but I also see FD Signifier and Last Week Tonight with John Oliver as influences. I really love how they break down like super complex topics. The rating system video definitely had some John Oliver influence. I don't know if that showed. Lesson 5. Give yourself time to be bad at things and wait to do the things that you're excited about. With something subjective like film criticism, I find that it's hard to track your improvement. With something that's physical like sports or weightlifting or running, there's usually like metrics you can use to measure your improvement, and you don't really have things like that with stuff that's like more related to the arts. In those first few years of writing reviews, like I can't check back to read them now, but I consider that to be the time that I was bad at criticism, or, to be generous to myself, I'll call it developmental years. So I might not have written much of actual value in that time, but I don't consider it a waste. But this point, I feel I can apply to a lot of other things, and I know I'm not always good at being patient with myself when I'm building a skill, whether that's writing or analysis or editing or voiceover for the video essays or improv or being able to actually throw my freaking disc where I meant to throw it in disc golf. Improving at stuff can just be a messy, inefficient, and frustrating process. And that's why I'm glad to announce that this video is sponsored by Skillshare. No, I'm kidding, we don't have enough viewers to be sponsored. To the second part of this point, I always recommend to anyone starting out on a new creative venture that they wait to do the thing that they're excited about. Because no matter how good you are when you start doing something, you're only going to get better at it. And I learned this because there's a movie that I covered on the podcast earlier than I should have. And I'll talk about that more in the next point. But something I didn't really take into account is that even though I had a few years of criticism under my belt at the point that I started, podcasting was a new skill that I needed to learn. And I think that first episode on Nightcrawler went surprisingly well for a first attempt, but in hindsight, I still probably would have picked a different movie to start with that I would have been more okay doing a bad job with. And at this point, I feel like I'm comfortable enough to do an episode on like something I really like The Social Network or Inception, but I'm still probably gonna wait a while just in case. And for the trend videos, I'm starting out with smaller trends because I feel like I'm still kind of learning how to make that kind of video. And I think it's good that I already had like 10 video essays that I'd done before starting to do those. And there's just stuff that I know I'm still in the growing phase with in terms of making those longer essays. So I'm just trying to ease myself into that and get better each time. Lesson 6: have humility and know when to shut up. This is the biggest one that I wish I could go back and tell my younger self. Film criticism doesn't exist in a vacuum. Art influences life, influences art, and critics are part of that equation, so we need to be responsible about it. The main reason I took my reviews down is because I wrote them in high school and I didn't know what I was talking about. The fact that I had very little experience of the world isn't a problem. The problem was that I wasn't self-aware of that. So I didn't take them down because of like anything specific that I said. I just felt like something infused with such an underdeveloped worldview was probably not valuable for anyone to read, especially because they don't have the context that they were written by like a 17-year-old. I did, like I said, try to save a copy of them just for my records, but I lost that. And I did a similar thing with the 2 episodes that we recorded on Gone Girl early on. It's an awesome movie, and I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't seen it, especially because it's like a super spoiler heavy movie. But it deals with gender politics in some pretty complex ways that I wasn't educated enough to be talking about as a 19-year-old. And I wanted to do it because it's one of the most like masterfully written movies ever, and I was super excited to dissect it. But in hindsight, I wish I had just at least waited a while to do it, or not cover the gender politics in it. And in fairness, it is a movie that is famously prone to being misread, so I'll cut myself a bit of slack there. And I don't think I went into it like super insensitively or with like a complete lack of nuance. But when I listened back to it a couple years later, I just didn't like how it sounded, and I thought it was better to take it down. And just to be clear, this isn't like a secret apology video. Nobody like called me out on this. I just felt like I should do it, and I'm mentioning that here in the hope that there's other people who can learn from that mistake. So these days I try to be more conscious about the movies that I cover and how I talk about them. Like stuff like Promising Young Woman and American History X are 2 excellent movies that I might just never do an episode on. I love that conversations about diversity and inclusion and important social issues are being discussed a lot in the world of film criticism. And I would love to take more part in that, but I've tried to be very measured about it when I do. Like, I'm fine when that kind of discussion comes up on the podcast and, giving my thoughts when they're asked of me. And I think we've had pretty valuable conversations about it, with stuff like the way, like, Psycho has aged well or not, and the way that The Boys deals with the real world issues. Like, it's not like we never do it, but I'm not gonna, like, make a video about the way that the Na'vi are portrayed in the Avatar movies, even though I definitely have issues with that. I just think that's probably not my place. So I'm not saying that the way that I go about engaging or not engaging with sensitive topics is the right way for anyone else. I just think it's the most responsible way for me personally to do that with my current level of knowledge. And beyond the like social responsibility side of it, I always try to keep in mind that like my takes could be wrong, and that, I might have not seen something that somebody else does that I didn't consider. I think arrogance gets in the way of good criticism, but it's still possible to be confident in your takes without being arrogant or dismissing other opinions. I hope I'm at that point, but it did take a while to find that balance, and I still have to check myself on it sometimes. I think it's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, where there's like a level of knowledge where you think you're really knowledgeable, but you don't know enough to realize how much you don't know. And I think that's how it works. And then eventually there's a threshold where you know more, but you also realize how much you don't know, so you don't present your ideas as dogmatically. And I know I spent a while in that overconfident mindset. Definitely some of that time in the early review years, and maybe even some of the time that I've done this podcast. And, that stage I think is probably pretty normal. The important thing is growing beyond it. And I hope I have, but I'm sure there's still a lot that I have to learn, and that's great. Lesson 7, last one. Don't ruin things for other people. After a couple of years of doing criticism, I found out that if I justified why I didn't like something, sometimes it had the effect of ruining it for somebody else. So I try to be careful about doing that. If my opinion of something is positive, I don't think there's any reason not to give it. But for negative opinions, I'm more cautious. For one specific example, I remember after seeing the live action Beauty and the Beast movie with some of my family, we saw it in theaters and we're driving home, and my mom was like, "Oh, what do you think of it?" And I said, "You don't want to know what I thought of it." And she was like, "No, I really do." So I gave my thoughts, which were, very negative because I really hate that movie. And when I was done, she just kind of sat there silently for a moment, and I was like, "I told you, don't want to know what I think of it." So when somebody asks me what I think of something I didn't like, I always at least try to give them plenty of warning before sharing my opinion, because even when people have insisted that I can't ruin something for them, sometimes they've been wrong. See also our episode on Wonder Woman 84, because I think I may have ruined that movie for Jelani when we covered it. So that's pretty much it. I might do another one of these in 2034 if I'm still doing this. And hopefully I can stand by what I've said here by then. And, hopefully you guys got something out of this too. And if you have thoughts on what I've said here, whether you agree or disagree, let me know in the comments, because I'm always trying to get better at this. Just, be polite about it, please. If you're new here and you made it all the way to the end of the video, we've got close to 100 podcast episodes on a bunch of different movies. And, I'm on all of them, but they also have some excellent co-hosts and guests. And you've definitely seen at least a few of the movies that we've covered. And we've also got a dozen video essays on the YouTube channel, and if that's more your thing, a few of them are quick, like less than 10 minutes. A couple are longer that are more like the 30 to 40 minute range. And we've also got a Patreon with bonus episodes and watch-alongs, so you can access that for $1 a month. I don't know what our next scheduled episode is going to be by the time this drops, but we'll have more regular episodes out soon. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.